Hello, I'm thinking of famous collaborations through history, and I'm doing it with Victoria Derbyshire from Newsnight. Hello.
Hi.
And Nick Watt from Newsnight too.
Hi, Adam.
Famous favourite collabs? I'm thinking Lady Gaga and Beyonce, Telephone, great
There's
song.
only one for me. Under Pressure, Bowie and Queen, because my kids, that's all they sing.
I'm going to say Kylie and Jason.
Oh, okay. Especially for you.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I'm feeling under pressure because what I've done is I've kind of invaded the Newsnight outside broadcast in Birmingham, which is going to be on BBC Two tonight, live, and it's quite a fancy production you got here.
Well, we are in the Central Library of Birmingham, and it is a stunning building. The heart of it is a cylinder, essentially, isn't it? And so each floor, you are surrounded by a circle of books.
That's right, and it's completely appropriate for Newscast, because obviously Adam Fleming is the more intellectual side of the BBC, and all these books here, actually, we had to prize him out of the medieval history section, but we're lucky that he is here now. And
well, the funny thing is that we've been sat in front of the computing section.
Yes.
So don't know how your JavaScript programming is.
No.
Anyway, right, on this episode of Newscast, we'll of course catch up with what Newsnight are doing and what's been happening in the general election campaign today.
Newscast. Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in Birmingham.
Hello, it's Victoria in Birmingham.
And it's Nick in Birmingham.
And Victoria, this is actually where you started out as a journalist.
I love Birmingham. I worked here in my first job in commercial radio as a reporter. I absolutely loved it. Commercial radio, you may know,
yes,
had no staff. I was literally the only reporter, and compared to BBC local radio, they had loads of reporters. So we were so hungry. I had sharp elbows. That's where I developed my sharp elbows.
Oh, right. OK,
yeah,
I wondered where that came from. What was your favourite story from that period?
Oh, gosh.
There's probably loads.
I mean, they're all like quite serious stuff, but it was the tail end of, I mean, this is showing my age, the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad
Right.
and all the corruption that was involved in that. I mean, Birmingham is a mega news patch. Superb. Used to whiz around the rotunda and the roads here in the little BRMB radio car.
And Nick, for us political journalists, it's been the site of many a Tory party conference. Some happy, some less happy for them.
That's right. After the political parties moved away from the seaside, I still pine for Blackpool. But there's another B on our lives. It's Birmingham. It's fascinating coming here over the last 15 years. Just the scale of development. There's just this incredible economic development going on. And it's the new by the side of the old. But also, I think the other great thing about Birmingham are the waterways. You just don't see them, they're not obvious, but once you get to know the waterways, incredible to go.
More canals than
Venice, yeah.
Is that true?
Well, I used to say it when I was a reporter here, so...
And you're scrupulously accurate, so it probably is true,
maybe.
Right, we're going to virtually go, though, from Birmingham to Scotland, though, because the SNP launched their manifesto for the election, and there, of course, was Ready Steady James Cook. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam.
Do you want to tell us about the vibe at the launch?
So, the launch was here in Edinburgh, in a place out on the western outskirts of the city, which I'm told is a bakery and cultural centre, which I didn't really understand. I didn't really know what that meant, but the pastries were good. That much I can tell you. And the vibe, well, it was busy. There were a lot of SNP politicians there, not just John Swinney, the leader who was in charge, obviously, of the launch, but they seemed pretty buoyant. They seemed, it seemed relatively slick. It went off from their perspective without a hitch. The document is shiny. It's not very long. It's only 28 pages long. And I said to John Swinney, I was like, oh, it smells of ink. And he's like, well, it's been printed, so it would. So it's like, thanks for my insightful commentary.
Also, I mean, Nick Watt's got a copy of it printed off here, not in colour, saving money on the printing. And actually, Nick, you've got it open at the page that says Independence, which is right at the front. It's not necessarily the first page, but it's definitely in the first few. Well,
and of course, the first page, I mean, James got it there. It does say, vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. So if you are in any doubt, there it all is. And I'm sure James can talk about it, but I mean, it talks about how John Swinney is saying that if they get a majority of Parliament, parliamentary seats in this Westminster election. That will be a mandate, as they say, to begin immediate negotiations with the UK government to give democratic effect to Scotland becoming an independent country.
James, just decode for us what that paragraph in the manifesto actually means, because I'm old enough to remember 2 years ago when Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister and leader of the SNP, and she said, a general election where the SNP won the majority of seats in Scotland would almost be a referendum on independence. The negotiations should start straight away.
Yeah, and there's also been previous talk, Adam, about whether or not the bar for negotiations to open on Scotland simply seceding from the rest of the United Kingdom would be a majority of votes in a Scottish referendum. It's obviously a much higher bar than a majority of the 57 Scottish seats that are being contested this time around. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, we've pretty much heard this before. What I wanted to know from John Swinney, because it wasn't totally clear in the text, when you look at the text, it says, if the SNP wins a majority of Scottish seats, the Scottish Government will be empowered to begin immediate negotiations with the UK Government to give democratic effect to Scotland becoming an independent country. I wanted to know if that meant that he thought you could skip the referendum, and the answer was no. He says there must be a referendum. It is the only democratic route to independence for Scotland. So that is clear. It would be a two-stage, at least, process. But let's be clear, Labour and the Conservatives are adamant that no matter what happens after this election, there are no circumstances whatsoever in which they would entertain allowing a second referendum on independence a decade after the first one. And it is, the Supreme Court has ruled, up to Westminster to decide whether or not Scotland can vote again.
And so if the SNP don't get a majority, James, is that independence dead for, what, a generation,
well,
5 years?
Yes,
what do you think?
Exactly, Victoria. I mean, that's the question. And I was saying to John Swinney, well, look, conversely, as you rightly say, if you don't get a majority, do you accept that that is Scotland, in essence, voting to remain for now in the Union? And he said, well, let's not prejudge what the Scottish people say. But yeah, the question's a really fair one. I mean, I think either way, it's very difficult to see if the SNP continues, and it insists it is continuing to stick to the idea that the only route is a referendum. If both of the UK parties say, come what may, there will not be a referendum, then it almost doesn't matter. In practical terms, obviously the SNP would argue it matters a lot in they would say moral terms, what Scotland votes for here. But in practical terms, it is difficult to see how there would be any progress towards a referendum. And in that sense, yes, obviously, if Scotland doesn't vote by a majority of seats for the SNP, then clearly their cause is dented, of course.
Right, we've talked a lot about John Swinney. Let's hear him in his own words. Here he is talking about the kind of broad principle of independence as he sees it in this manifesto.
In 2021, they voted for a Scottish Parliament with a clear majority for independence and for a referendum on the question of independence. That democratic choice must be respected. At this election, we have the opportunity to reinforce the case for Scotland becoming an independent country. It is the substance of the case that will take us there. And that starts with the economy.
The they he's talking about obviously being the people of Scotland. Nick, what did you want to say?
No, I was just interested to ask James about the idea of a referendum, because it seems that the wording talking about opening negotiations with the UK government is the so-called gold standard referendum, the 2014 one, which is essentially gifted by Westminster, done under sort of Westminster parliamentary powers. They gifted that power to the Scottish Parliament for 2 years. It's that rather than a unilateral referendum decided by Holyrood.
Yeah, I think so, and that stems back to this. I think you're right, Nick. I think that stems back to this Supreme Court decision that said, an official, as you say, gold standard referendum can only be held with Westminster's consent. But let's be honest, it just doesn't seem likely that there is going to be a referendum anytime soon. If you're the SNP, you would say, look, we had a mandate from the last Holyrood election in 2021, and that between the SNP and the Greens, they had a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, still do, and that amounts to a mandate for a referendum. But I think, moving on from it, given we know for whether it's right or wrong that it's not going to happen, the question is what happens next? And I think really the debate about independence now goes to the next Scottish parliamentary election in 2026, just a couple of years' time, because what the SNP is trying to do here is to say, look, the UK is broken, it has low growth, low productivity, high inequality. These problems are entrenched. The Conservatives, they argue, have made them worse, and they contend that Labour will be unable to fix them. And so they are thinking in 2 years' time they'll be going to the Scottish population in the 2026 Holyrood election and saying, look, the problem isn't just the Tories, the problem is the whole Westminster system. Now we need to revisit this. So it isn't only about, by any means, this general election, their referendum strategy or their independent strategy. I think they're looking forward to it because they know they're not in a great place in the polls and they're bracing themselves for losses here. But they're looking to see how they can perhaps spring back, and that's what they hope for in 2026. Labour, of course, very much hope to use this election as a springboard in Scotland to gain seats and spring on to do the same at Holyrood and even take control of the Scottish Government.
And James, the thing that surprised me reading the manifesto on my laptop when I was on the train up to Birmingham was how much the SNP are talking about things that should happen in England and the UK generally. For example, the rates of income tax in the rest of the UK being increased so that they're the same as the rates in Scotland, because the Scottish Government's got control over the income tax rates and the thresholds. And also talking about what the budget for the NHS in England should be. Just explain their thinking about why they feel they can talk about all of that stuff.
Yeah, it just requires a little bit of picking apart for newscasters, and we've talked about it before, and many newscasters will know how this works. But the Scottish Government's overall budget is in large part determined by what happens at Westminster, because if the UK Government decides to increase spending on anything, anything that's reserved to Westminster and devolved to Holyrood, so say they increase spending on the NHS in England, there will be a consequential increase in the Scottish Government's overall budget. The Scottish Government doesn't need to spend it on health, but John Swinney is strongly suggesting that what he wants to see is the UK Government, whoever it is after this election, to increase spending on the English health service so that the budget he can spend, and he says he would spend it on the Scottish health service, goes up. So that's part of this debate, but it's also about political dividing lines, isn't it? He's trying to say, look, we are a socially progressive party. We believe that with a bit higher taxation, and you can debate whether it's a bit higher or a lot higher, and it is worth noting that the threshold at which people in Scotland pay more tax than England is around £29,000. You're not talking millionaires here. John Swinney says, oh, it's only a little, just over that, that they're paying extra, but it goes up and up. The point is that he says, look, we're just having to do this because of the state of public services. We need to raise the money somehow, and Scotland's progressive taxation model, he says, is something that England should embrace.
And James, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the manifesto says the UK government should increase NHS spending in England by 16 billion, which through those consequentials, as you say, would yield 1.6 billion for Holyrood. And what's interesting about that is it does highlight the fundamental challenge for the SNP in this Westminster election, which is they're both a government and an opposition. They're a government because they've been in power in Holyrood for 17 years, but they're in opposition because they are in opposition to the UK government. And that sort of request for the UK government to spend that more money in England so it bounces into Scotland is trying to sort of large up the opposition side rather than the we've been responsible for the NHS in Scotland for 17 years side.
And I love they make the bold idea of
definitely.
just rejoining the EU without any real details.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all of these things are designed to showcase the differences between the parties and in John Swinney's view, to showcase what he sees as a fundamental difference between an English electorate, which he suggests is moving further away from a Scottish electorate, which he would suggest is further to the left. So, yeah, it's definitely a case of staking out the ground.
James, thank you very much. And talk about the NHS, Victoria. That's kind of a big theme of your show here in Birmingham tonight, isn't it?
It is. We are here to talk to our audience of 50 to 60 people and a group of politicians, including the man who wants to be England's new health secretary in 2 weeks' time, Wes Streeting, and Maria Caulfield from the Conservatives, and the SNP will be with us, and the Lib Dems. But really, we're here to talk to people about their experiences of the NHS. Every single person has a story about the NHS, wherever you are in the country. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We're going to hear from a university student called Lily, who has been waiting over a year for mental health treatment. The target is 18 weeks. 18 weeks she has been waiting for 12 months. And she says, I mean, she's been diagnosed with anxiety and depression. She's almost forgotten what she's waiting for. She's absolutely lost in the system. We're going to hear from Amanda, who has arthritis and has had for many years. She can barely walk. She uses walking sticks. She uses a wheelchair. She's currently waiting for an operation on her hands, she says, but they won't do that until I have my knees done, which they won't do until I've lost weight, which I can't do because I can't move around. She's kind of trapped.
Yeah.
So who has got the solutions to those really intractable problems?
And Nick, it was interesting listening to Newscast on Sunday with Laura and Paddy, because Wes Streeting had been on Laura's show doing his big interview and actually had blown open the whole discussion about, well, actually, what Labour are talking about in their manifesto and what extra money they'd put into the NHS for extra appointments to deal with the waiting list that Victoria was just talking about is just sort of the tip of the iceberg, actually, about what the NHS budget is overall. And that started a much bigger conversation and applied to the Lib Dems and the Tories as well. It's like, actually, the manifesto promises are small beans compared to the NHS budget overall.
That's right. I mean, if you think about it, the Conservative government, David Cameron and George Osborne, increased the NHS budget by, I think, 1.4% over inflation. This Labour manifesto would increase it by 1.1% over inflation. So, that is pretty small beans in comparison. I mean, what Wes Streeting no doubt will be telling Victoria tonight is that this is a very, very difficult fiscal situation, made worse, I'm sure he'll say, by Liz Truss's mini budget, and Labour is having to cut its cloth accordingly. But it was interesting what Wes Streeting said in that interview with Laura Koonsberg, because he talked about how what they're putting in the Labour manifesto, I think it's 2 billion extra spending, and here it is on that list there, cut NHS waiting times with 40,000 more appointments, double the number of cancer scanners. He used that word, he said, that's the foundation. And then Laura instantly picked up on that and said, oh, it's just the start, is it? And it was interesting that the Labour Party is trying to be incredibly cautious about what they're saying. And Wes Streeting, who is one of, if not the best communicators of the Labour Party, may have perhaps gone ever so slightly off message.
And I suppose, Victoria, that's the beauty of an election campaign. Like, these front benchers from whatever party have to turn up to things like this, and you can basically take the plot line along and quiz them about things that they said before, and we all learn a bit more as a result.
Well, hopefully. I mean, hopefully with our audience, that's exactly what they'll do. We want a conversation between members of the audience and the politicians. It doesn't need to be adversarial. It doesn't need to be just a question and four politicians answer it. Let's have a conversation to see what potential solutions there are. And also, of course, we know about the pandemic, we know about COVID, but there were issues in the NHS in England, certainly before then. So why are we where we are now? And are the sums, as Nick said, being promised by Labour, being promised by the Conservatives, are they really enough to affect any kind of mini transformation?
And just in terms of hosting a show like this, I mean, this is quite weird for me, because I normally sit in the little Newscast cupboard, which is a cupboard designed to look like a living room. We're now like in a giant library, and there's I can see about 5 cameras, and you've got your 50 seats over there for the audience. What difference does it make when you've got like actual voters there kind of in the studio with you, pop-up studio with you? It is,
for me, you just get this incredible energy from people. You know, it's late at night, it's after the watershed, people are kind of up for it, and they are representative of the way people voted at the last election, but they want to be here because they want the opportunity to have this conversation with people who can come up with policies that affect their daily lives, you know? It's a real kind of, for me, it's the most dynamic of shows.
And you know what Vic is saying now? This absolutely shows what Vic is amazing at, which is, you know, Vic is very, very good at interviewing politicians, and you like doing that. But Vic completely comes alive when you have people who are not politicians, people who've got stories to tell. And it is actually one of the great privileges working with Vic is that...
This is turning into This Is Your Life, Victoria Derbyshire.
I think it's really interesting. You know, there's this thing, show your workings, show behind the scenes. But when we have people on Newsnight who aren't politicians, who've got stories to tell, they gather in what we call the green room, which is the special room. Vic goes in there before there, sits down, talks to every single one of them, gets their story. It's what really brings Vic alive, and it brings Newsnight alive, and it'll bring it alive tonight when you're hearing those stories from people who don't have a mandate, who aren't elected. They've got their stories to tell.
Victoria, I feel I should bring out a big red book for This Is Your Life, because we've done your early years.
Younger
Nick has
listeners,
just
you'll have to
tribute.
Google what This Is Your Life is.
It's quite good. It was a good show, though, wasn't it?
It was all right.
Oh, I always loved it.
Depends who was on, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. True. And also, you were always like, when's the Muppets on? That was 80s television for you. Oh, in terms of other stories, Nick, today, I mean, never a dull moment in this election campaign. A few things to pick up on, some of which are really quite eye-catching. Inflation has hit the 2% target. That was the objective. That's what the Bank of England is meant to be doing to manage the economy.
Yeah, and the Rishi Sunak target was to halve it. And when he said that, it was 11%. So not only has he more than halved it, as you say, hits the target rate. When Gordon Brown gave independence to the Bank of England, the target, the framework for inflation, it's meant to be 2%. Interestingly, though, services, other parts of, when you sort of break the inflation rate down, services quite high, it looks quite sticky. And I think the markets this afternoon were suggesting that we may not be heading in the direction of a particularly early cut in interest rates.
And Victoria, did you see that Taylor Swift's Eras tour might have an impact on the inflation rate? Because so many people are going to her concerts, the tickets are so expensive, and the hotels jack up their prices. Wow. It could actually have an effect on the whole economy.
Well, my 20-year-old son is going to be responsible for inflation going up then, because he's got a ticket for August the whatever it is at Wembley.
Oh, and of course she's doing it over two different months, because I went this month. Also, Nick, though, in terms of the inflation thing, that feeds into the Bank of England, who have a meeting tomorrow on Thursday to decide interest rates. But kind of the rule is the Bank of England don't make a decision about interest rates when there's an election on, in case it helps one side or the other.
Yes, it's the Monetary Policy Committee. They're in charge of it, and they would be very, very cautious about doing anything, because we are so close to the election. It's, 2 weeks tomorrow. But it's interesting that the markets were pricing in that we wouldn't be seeing an immediate cut in interest rates.
The other numbers that people are obsessing over, and I do mean in a certain bit of politics, obsessing over maybe too much, you could argue.
You're going to say polls.
Opinion polls. And
yeah, it's really it's winding me up.
Is it?
Am I allowed to say that?
I think because it's winding me up too. Because I think they're great tools, but they shouldn't be. They're not the whole show.
I totally agree. And how many times in recent memory have the polls been wrong? I'm so wary of it. I'm so wary of it.
Yeah, I mean, does an election run the polls, or do the polls run an election? And it seems to be the polls are running this general election, because we have these massive MRP polls where they're polling 10 to 12,000 people. In your sort of normal run-of-the-mill poll, it's sort of 1,500 people. The MRPs, it's 10 to 12,000 people. And then what they do is they have so much data, they're then able to sort of impose that data in the 650 constituencies and say that's what's going to happen here and that's what's going to happen there. And yeah, it is just having an incredible impact. But, in the parties, in the Labour Party, they're not complacent, but they are, they've got smiles on their faces. And in the Conservative Party, the mood is really bleak.
Although, Vic, we should remember the BBC's got rules about how we as journalists report on these polls. You're never meant to start a news story by saying a poll today said this, and that's why you don't see that on Newsnight or Newscast or the 6 o'clock news.
Exactly.
The other eye-catching story, Nick, and this is from Chris Mason, is one of the Prime Minister's close protection squad being under investigation for placing a bet on the date of the election.
That's right. And obviously this dates back to Craig Williams, who was the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Private Secretary during the last Parliament, facing an investigation, an official investigation, because he, on the 19th of May, placed a date that there would be a bet that there would be a July election. And then obviously on the Wednesday after that, Sunday, the Prime Minister made that announcement. Craig Williams issued a statement saying he'll cooperate with that inquiry and admitted that it didn't look particularly good. But what happened after there was that announcement about Craig Williams is that basically, I think it's the Gambling Commission, said that we want to look at every single bet placed in the month of May related to July poll, and they're obviously going through it with a fine-tooth comb.
And a police officer has been arrested and suspended from duties.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just going to... You're such a pro, Vic. I was going to read that out, but I had to look down my laptop, and you just knew it off by heart. That's why it's going to be a great show tonight on Newsnight. Thank you very much for letting me come along and basically steal your resources and your microphones and your cameras.
Thank you for having us on Newscast.
Anytime.
Thank you for stealing the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Newscast from the BBC.